Hello, everyone. My name is Christina, and I'm the web editor here at HFR. Welcome to our coffee chat. Feel free to get a warm beverage. I just have an empty mug here. Get a warm beverage if you like. I feel like it's just gotten cool enough here in Tempe, Arizona to warrant a warm beverage. Our first coffee chat was actually in November 2020. So it's been really exciting to watch this series evolve during my time here at HFR. I'm thrilled that this coffee chat will feature contributors from our Revolutionary Forums web issue. And I can't wait to hear more about our guest hybrid work in a moment. This year, our fall coffee chat is the second and final event of the HFR Fall Language Series. The series consists of 2 educational programs centered on increasing accessibility to HFR's archive of printed work, discussing the importance of literary translation and its ethics, and introducing participants to new modes of writing and literary craft. Our previous event, the 1,000 Languages Project virtual launch, took place last Tuesday, October 25th. Recordings of last week's event and tonight's coffee chat will be up on the HFR events page soon. These programs were made possible by AZ Humanities. Hayden's Ferry Review and 1,000 Languages also acknowledges the 22 Native nations that have inhabited this land for centuries. Arizona State University's 4 campuses are located in the Salt River Valley on ancestral territories of Indigenous people, including the Acamel Autumn, Pima, and Pipash Maricopa Indian communities, whose care and keeping of the lands allows us to be here today. We know that a land acknowledgement without action is not sufficient and are making efforts towards equitable practices, most immediately by waiving the submission fee for all Indigenous writers who would like to submit creative work to HFR. If you identify as Indigenous, we encourage you to submit. All attendees for this night's event will be entered into a drawing for HFR issues and stickers, Lucy Zhang's chapbook Hollowed, and postcards of Nkosi Nkululeko's square poem, The Night, which will be discussed tonight. Finally, please use the chat as a space to celebrate what you hear. Feel free to share moving lines from our guests or reflect on the conversation. If you would like to ask a question for the discussion later in the evening, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Throughout the event, HFR's senior editor, Susan, will be sharing links to the author's work and more. Now, I'd like to welcome Nicole to the stage, our translations editor, to introduce our guests.
Hello, everyone. So happy to be here. Thank you, Christina, for that introduction and beginning of the session. So happy that we're celebrating our revolutionary forms. I've been all day thinking about how this all came to be, my little seed idea that became this full issue with the support of HFR. Yeah, I'm just excited to be here. And I'm so excited that we have Lucy and Nkosi to talk with us today. I'm gonna go ahead and read their bios and then we're gonna start our wonderful conversation. Lucy Zhang writes, codes, and watches anime. Her work has appeared in Cast of Wonders, Fireside Magazine, Wigleaf, and elsewhere. She is the author of the chapbooks Hollowed with 30 West Publishing, out this year, and Absorption with Harbor Review, also out this year. Find her at Twitter on Dango_ramen. And we'll post some of this information on the chat as well if you want to see more and learn more about our wonderful writers. Nkosi Nkuruleko's work is published in Anomaly, Chess Life Online, Hayden's Ferry Review, Oxford Poetry, The Nation, Poetry Northwest, and more. He is anthologized in the Best American Poetry 2018, Bettering American Volume 3, and Furious Flower, Seeding the Future of African American Poetry. Nkosi is a poetry, music, and chess instructor from Harlem. So please help me give a warm welcome to our writers. We're gonna go ahead and get started with our conversation. Hi, Lucy.
Hello.
Okay, I'm so excited. We wanted to start with talking a little bit about the pieces that were published in a revolutionary forms issue. So if we could kick this off by just talking a little bit about the process that you sort of follow through to create these pieces. Um, and then I know we're also going to share them in the screen so people could follow through. But yeah, just kind of walk us through a little bit of how these wonderful pieces came to be.
Do you want to, I was like, did you want to go first, Lucy, or?
It's all yours.
Oh, okay. Great. So I'm gonna, all right, first start off with, all right, so thank you, Nicole, for having me here. Thank you, Hayden's Ferry Review, and glad to be in conversation with you, Lucy. All right, so I guess the process of it sort of, I mean, it always starts small. I probably should have been able to, let's take a picture of it, but I had like a notebook where I started really small on just like 4 squares and having, putting in certain words, and I was trying to see, oh, can like, can one word go into the next word, and can the top word go into the bottom word? And when it happened, I was like, oh my God, mind blown and stuff like that. So that's where it started. But then I think when I started doing it a little bit more, I saw a few examples. There was one square poem, and I'll sort of like actually get ready to screen share so to have like a visual. Okay, here we go. So with the square poem, like, yeah, like I said, it first started off where it was only just the, it was just the first, like, just a 2x2 type of thing, and then I thought, like, why can't it be more? Why can't it, like, go as far as I want? And so I saw some what you call it, some examples by a writer, Lewis Carroll, who has a square poem that's a 6x6 that read the same way across and down, and like, it really looked amazing. And I was trying to figure out like how to do it, and I couldn't really figure it out, like sort of looking at it. But I think when it was sort of when I kind of like made a because I'm into chess, I think my chess background has allowed me to take certain concepts from chess and maybe apply it into poetry. At first, I'm writing about these concepts, and I'm writing like taking the ideas of strategies and piece play and seeing how that reflects in my life. But then I'm like, how can I actually see how the board can be useful as a layout, and I mean as a plane where I can sort of play in. And so I kind of like was thinking, let me just put in the first the first sentence, that's right up here, just taking that first sentence, just write it there, and then I repeated it, when it has to be going down vertically on this far left side. So it might have like the art of losing isn't hard to master up here, and then it will go back down, the art of losing isn't hard to master down here. And then I started to slowly build from there, because that's what I saw, like seeing things being read exactly, being read the same horizontally and vertically. But across the months that turned into years, like I started to develop a way of like figuring out how it can not just be symmetrical. What is the asymmetric nature of language that can kind of help me fulfill my task, or not even task, but just fulfill what I wanted to say. Man, I'm trying to figure out where, because this can really spiral, and I feel like I can like just keep on going. But I'm like, in terms of just the immediate process is by putting language in a grid and kind of seeing how I can say what I want in a form where all the words are being utilized twice, and not just once. And in the night poem, this is actually having all these words be utilized 3 times, because you have these certain numbers that are going in order to create an entirely new poem. So that was the idea. And the process getting to it is a bunch of notes taking between like looking at, math lectures and then poetry lectures and chess, and then kind of like trying to figure out where they all kind of like meet structurally. So with poetry, I see like um, uh, the syntactical arrangements is really interesting and consistent in certain ways. We see certain poets from the Black arts movement who have a certain sound, kind of like utilizing textual, visual, but also just a syntactic kind of like familiarity. And then you have like the beats movement, or have wherever in terms like from contemporary to the Renaissance, and they have their different sounds, but they're kind of like using certain syntactic tricks that are of their time. And so I'm trying to figure out how can I utilize my language to say what I want to say and apply it here. So I had to arrange certain forms of words. Like if it's a verb, I have to arrange it in a particular way to allow me to utilize and create not utilize, but just to create sentences that fit in with themes. So I think I'll just stop there before I kind of like go into the thing.
I had a question. So what did you struggle with most in terms of trying to compose or try to express your meaning with this form?
Sorry, can you repeat that question one more time?
Basically, what did you struggle with most in terms of trying to use this forum to express your intent? Or did you not struggle at all? Was this easy compared to writing a more conventional poem?
Yeah, actually, to some extent it's easier for me, but I think it was because I kind of like thought this way. I feel like I was more of a visual learner, and sometimes when having like certain prompts, when having certain prompts like be given, sometimes it's like the stakes really feel intense because like it's written out and you're supposed to like if they talk about a sonnet and like with a certain rhyme scheme in a particular way, or maybe the meter is done on the line, the meter is organized in a certain way on the line, in terms of like how many feet that you're utilizing or whatever, in what order. That felt like a lot when you're just writing it. But it's like, I feel like when putting it on a grid, because I was, introduced to chess by my mother when I was as young as 3, and then kind of like that being just a part of my life, I truly just looked like visually kind of like gathered information and kind of like applied. So I was like really interested in visual arts when I was younger, and still now, but more when I was younger. And then I felt like the hardest part about this, like this part, I'm actually feels like I keep on this is a noun. And then I understand, well, there's not a noun, like what other types of words follows nouns? Like a noun can be moving, but a noun can be between something, so I can add a preposition in here. This is a verb, so a noun is demanding something, right? But it can also, the art between, or the living between times incremental abandonment. I can shift it based on understanding like, oh, what are the different type of choices that I can utilize here. And I felt like chess kind of prepared me for that, as of just sort of that form of like calculation, and then just inputting it. But the hardest part now is figuring out about punctuation. It's so subtle, but it's like I try to get the punctuation to be applicable both horizontally and vertically. But like when I get to the night square, the punctuation has to be a little bit more flexible. Like you have to have like just a little bit more flexibility, figuring out what it means in poems. So I'm like, the task right now is like, how can I have the punctuation also be functional in three different on three different axes, like, and instead of just two. And that's like that's the hard part for me right now.
Awesome. Is my internet connection still stable? I think I had some lag.
We can hear you, Lucy.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I was really, and Lucy, just, I mean, sort of piggybacking on that of like your particular poem, the ways that in which like you kind of, it's almost like you're diving inward in a sense. Like at least from my poems, it feels like it is on a sort of two-dimensional plane, but then it's like in this digital circular space, I mean, I'm wondering like, oh man, those what kind of like what also inspired that, but also like how that process of digging deeper into like these subsections that kind of like opens new meanings and new terms. I guess how did the concept of that circular shape and the digital form, I'm mucking it up because like you're actually coding, like you're actually, or you're doing like very technical things digitally that I'm curious about in terms of like how that inspired the direction of that poem.
Yeah, of course. I guess that's a nice segue. I will start screen sharing. I wonder if you need to, okay. 1 second. All right, can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, so this is Thoughts from a Self-Perceived Hero, and it uses something called v3.js, which is a JavaScript framework that was actually built for the New York Times, because I'm sure you've noticed that the New York Times has a lot of data visualizations, and they use these charts to express data instead of art, of course. And one of the things that this kind of structure is often used for is to show how how you can drill down in data and what comprises a thing. So I, of course, wanted to use it for something else, but it kind of uses the same idea as that. So you can drill down into each thing, and if you hover, you'll see what each little chunk says. So if you keep drilling down, you'll kind of see that like each composition here kind of encompasses its adjacent few categories. So if we say like essential morals, and you boil down to like fairness and equality and no sacrifice and things like that, and then you can go back to where we were at originally. So this kind of came about because I was just exploring what you could do visually in terms of expressing data. And then the text itself came afterward. I believe at the time that I was actually writing this, coding, whatever, it was at the time where the Ukraine-Russian war just broke out. So that was on my mind. So I took it on a more abstract sense because war is war is in art a lot, and it's an interesting thing to think about, especially when people have such subjective opinions of what is right or wrong. So it was a kind of combination of those two things that created this. And in terms of the actual process, a lot of it was easy to do because of the constraints that I had. For example, I couldn't make things too long, otherwise it would be too hard to read, but it could be long enough where that if you drill down to a certain section, you would eventually be able to read it. So it kind of forces the user to keep clicking in a certain sense. So that was pretty much how it came about. And then I built the lines after actually coming up with the form. And that's actually how I do a lot of the interactive things that I've made so far, I'll code up something interesting and fun, and then I'll figure out what I want to tell with it. Part of it is because at some point, you know, you get kind of annoyed by the subjectivity of writing. So I just want, okay, I want something that works or doesn't work. Let me just write this code and, you know, I can tell obviously if it's working or broken, and then I'll figure out everything afterward. So in a sense, it was kind of like a comfort area where I could get instant answers and see if something was working or not. Unlike a story where you have no idea if it's working or not until someone tells you, but then another person tells you something else. So yeah, that was pretty much how it came about.
Wow.
Oh my God, I just took so many notes. It's so wonderful to hear how the pieces came about, but then also hearing a little bit of how each of you sort of your process and like creating some of your work, or like the influences, like how did you land on creating this work that sort of just blurs all the lines, and the fun behind it. So yeah, I'm wondering if y'all wanted to speak a little bit more about how, I think it was talked on, but maybe a little bit more on like how you landed on creating work that's outside of the prescriptions of genre, or I guess what's expected in like a poetry piece, and sort of, yeah, like what joys or what beautiful things it brings to you and in the process.
Yeah. Let me turn on the light first. It's getting pretty dark. Who wants to go first?
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, I mean, I can just hop on that. Yeah, I feel like that. I feel like especially when you fail at something, you're kind of ended up in another space that's creative and just beyond the the conventions that we normally write into just by failing. So I think that's kind of like been a guiding light in a way, because not for, I think failure is not even bad. So I think like when I'm looking at a piece and there are certain parts either that I don't understand about it, I feel like when I kind of go into that, like wondering why I don't understand something about it, it kind of like just allows like another doorway in terms of like the possibilities of like what I can do even with that type of language. And so yeah, I think a lot has just been about failing, or at least failing productively, hopefully.
Yeah, I think in terms for me, a lot of the, I don't, a disclaimer, I don't make as many of these right now because I did this as an escape from, normal writing and the subjectivity of it. But now that work, because I code for full time, and now that I have to do so much coding, I don't want to code outside of that. So I don't really do these as much. It's an escape for me. That's essentially what it is. So it's not, I think the exploration part is kind of like an interesting hybrid that can get both annoying and kind of soothing in certain ways. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but and then I don't really view these as, it's hard to say how the iteration works because a lot of the times I'm just debugging more than my brain is in writing mode. So when I'm actually updating the text and changing the lines, it's more like, well, I need it to fit here and I need this interaction to work. Let me change the text a little bit. And then it ultimately comes down to like a bunch of constraints that I get set under because of whatever technical issues that I'm facing. And then from there, I think the interpretation almost comes afterwards. I've got this text, I've got this interactivity. What can I do with it? And then when you interact with it, you have so many different ways of experiencing the same piece, which is also fun because other people are experiencing it a different way.
Yeah, I think like the interactivity part, like, or the many ways that you can look at the work is something that I was really like excited about when I first encountered these pieces. I was like, oh my God, there's so many ways to like read this and like work with it, or like the different motions to go through them. I think like there's some challenge that I really like. So yeah, I'm still thinking about that. Also the annoying and soothing, I'm like, that sounds really right. When you're working with something that's a little like out there, like in my own work, when I sort of do something a little less conventional, it's like why can't I make it work? But then once you do, it's like, yes, finally. Yeah, it's that feeling. Yeah, I think like uh, thinking a little bit about the constraints or some of the sort of tools that both of you thought or mentioned. I'm thinking about how with the process that you work with to create this, how do you then approach revising them, or like what are the uh, struggles and beauties of that process with something that's not like, yeah, let me just delete this line, or like let me, like something as simple as that. Like what is that rigorous process that you go through?
Yeah, all right. So I think this question kind of like for a while through the conversation with some of the questions, I was like, yo, how am I going to answer this? But I think like this is a way that I can kind of get into sort of a way I approached it. So like this is not the poem that has that particular word. All right, so there's some poems like with certain words that were really interesting. All right, one more time. I'm gonna just scroll one more time up. All right, so when I'm revising, I'm thinking along the lines of word associations and kind of figuring out how when a few words are gathered together, you kind of like are given a picture. And this is actually something that I realized even when sort of subsection, like sort of the lineage of grid poems, is that people like Khadijah Queen has utilized grids in her book Anodyne, and in there she's actually doing after poems after folks like Mark McMorris, and he had a book called the Book of Landings, and where he had these grids, but they weren't supposed to be read, as sentences. They were literally just words that are kind of like describing scenes of the diaspora in a sense. And he kind of with these words, it's like you just see a word, you just see certain words, Dakar, or you might see I'm kind of like I'm trying to think of like particular words, but it'll be like, it might be chain, or in terms like it might be sand or earth, in terms of like, and then he starts to have like a lot more words than that, obviously, but then together it kind of like sets a scene that you don't even need sentences in order to understand what this is about. So with this, it's kind of like taking that idea and figuring out how are certain words living together in their direction. So I'm like sort of thinking about, if I have, talking about, like, I'm trying to look for a specific word that I used. So right here regarding like time, with the idea of time, like, and I was trying to actually get the whole background, but with the idea of times incremental abandonment. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Living demands times incremental abandonment. So when I'm thinking about even the word living, I'm just thinking naturally about, you know, how much time we have left, or even how we utilize our time. So I feel like when I understand that, I'm already holding on to a noun that can kind of like be utilized as a vehicle into like the following thought. So living demands times incremental abandonment as our memories. So that'll be another way of like, because I'm already on the flow of memory on time, I'm also thinking about the past, the past that is also long gone. So it's almost like, you know, in certain workshops, you'll have like these word banks that you might even build in order to create these poems. So it's almost like doing that same concept, but then actually having to use all those words, right? So with that type of process, then I have to ask myself, how is it going to live on the, how is it going to live on, let's say, the vertical axis? And so with memories, memories are provoking and guards are choice, right? So our choices are also things that we can't change because we already did them. So it's kind of like, understand, because I already utilized memories, I'm going to be asking myself, asking myself, what type of, what do memories do? And I might say that they are provoking, but they're also guarding. You know, the memories are guarding certain things that are that I treasure and that I have to keep on holding. And then, but they also provoke the choices. Guards our choice. It also like sort of provokes the choices that I make in real time. So my memory of like maybe how I might mess up trying to talk about a form is also now provoking and guarding my decision of like how I'm explaining it now. So it's like things like that is kind of like allowing me to just hold on these words and then kind of like see their relationship with one another, and then find out what the verbs are in order to keep the sentence moving, what the verbs and what the prepositions are to keep this to keep the sentence moving. So when I say like the living keep, I could say the living keep us in terms of like using pronouns instead of denying, which I have right over here. Let me take that off. But it's like, now I can't go off. But in terms like it right here is denying, but I could have actually utilized they keep us, or they keep them, like the living keep them reoccurring citizens of death, or keep their reoccurring citizens of death. And so now it kind of like it's going in different directions of like, who am I addressing? How is it gonna, how the sentence gonna keep on moving? But then I chose denying. So I wanted to give it an action. What are the living doing? And they keep on denying reoccurring citizens of death. And so it's like using the verbs to give these nouns an action, and like having these word banks kind of like be utilized together to have a thematic connection. So that's where I'll stop.
Awesome. I was so absorbed into listening to the whole process that I forgot what the actual question was.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I think we were all very immersed. It was a little bit about revising these pieces with all the constraints that they come with. Like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah. Before I go into my process, I had a question about the square poem. How do you know when it's done, basically? Or do you
It
not?
is never, it's never done. And that's actually the most exciting part, is because like even with that night poem, I'm still like either tweaking with it and stuff like that. It's just like, it's all the object, like the inspiration of like time but just of like certain simple lines but complex forms is kind of like the idea of like, how can I say what I normally would say in a regular conversation and then put it into a grid. And so that kind of keeps me going and trying to figure out how it can be even more smooth in different places. So it's never done. It just constantly changes and evolves. Yeah.
How much do you find it changes when you revisit?
It depends on what I'm. It depends on what I'm looking to. It just. I mean, it can change a lot. It depends on what I'm looking for, because I think sometimes there'll be certain days where I'm like, trying to figure out, like, if I can use even like certain words that might have using homonyms, like where certain words can act as a noun and a verb. So a noun that can be moved vertically, and then like if it's read vertically, and if it's read horizontally, it might be a verb or a noun, or whatever the opposite is. And with that, it like I can go on a long time, because I think the object then becomes, how can a word changes its identity without moving or without shifting. So like, just the idea of what is it, water, being both a noun, but also you can use it as a verb, is inspiring, of like, how can it not move at all, but then like create different momentums. Like at first the noun kind of feels kind of like settling, whereas a verb feels like active, like it's about to sort of transition to the next thing. So I think when I'm thinking about that, it can take it can be a whole revision of a lot, because I'm trying to do it as much as I can, so that the poems can actually really have a different feel when it's read in different directions, as opposed to having the words kind of like do the same thing.
Yeah, I find that's definitely a common trend among, I think, all of the different crazy form poems, because I'm often thinking the same thing when I'm coding, writing my pieces, because you're under the constraints of the different form. And I guess I will share my screen briefly on the process, or revision, I should say. So this is the source code for what's on that webpage. And basically the way I went about writing this was in the form of a dictionary. A dictionary is a data structure with a key that maps to values. So you can see here, we have a key like name, saving the world, children, and then you just you keep going down in this nested kind of form. And this is the data structure that D3 takes in. So that's why there's the name and children, which is what you need to have. But I wrote this not with just plain text or, just kind of jotting down ideas. I wrote this directly into this form. So like for the square poem, I'm already building up all these constraints immediately from the get-go, and you're trying to figure out how the words should work, what should be nested into what. So the revision was basically tweaking a bunch of these things and trying to figure out how I wanted it to read, depending on the order and depending on what person clicked in, and how you got into the next nested little spiel of stuff. So in certain forms, you can actually collapse these, and it makes editing much easier. But interestingly enough, that's actually how the actual piece looks. You can effectively collapse it, but more like expanding and going out from the whole. So it was kind of a big jump to go from this to the actual visual. So I would have to constantly go back and forth and see, okay, what does it actually look like? What does it feel like? Versus, oh, the super straightforward dictionary and how everything looks, which to me seems straightforward, at least at this point. And then the bottom parts are like the nitty gritty code things that are not too interesting here for folks. But yeah, so what it basically is actually, writing a poem or story in a data structure, which is an interesting way of looking at things. And it definitely frames your mindset in a way that we got at earlier about these constraints. But yeah, I think I could even show, I might have just pushed it all at once, but so I can commit every single change. So sometimes when I change like a single line, you'll see that diff. Let me see if I can actually pull that up. Yeah, so in some things, so these are not very useful, but sometimes it's more granular, so I can see the actual process of my thoughts with every single I can see that, oh, okay, so I changed this or that, and I changed whatever text, I deleted this, I added that, this is what my revision process was like. It's not always granular here, but it's something that I do look back on to see like, okay, why did I choose these words? At what point in time did I do this? It's an interesting sort of history tracker.
Have you found any sort of patterns even in your process of with your process of creating this piece? Have you found that your skill set your skill sets have influenced how you even go about organizing your thoughts when you're even just writing on the page? Have you felt that like has it either changed, or have you just figured out something about yourself and your way of acknowledging patterns?
I'd say it's probably the latter, because the way I write is pretty similar to how I code, in that I just do it. I don't plan, which is probably a bad thing in terms of the job and coding, because I probably should plan, but you know, there's no time. We got to ship features. I just need to hack it out. And that's exactly how I write too. I don't plan. I'm just like, all right, crank out these words, try to get something together.
But that's really interesting of like not planning it. So I mean, because in my head, like when you think about code, everything looks so very specific and like very purposeful. And it's like just the fact of kind of like going in there and building as you kind of, you know, almost feel is like just really amazing. I like, have you felt any sort of pressure or even dissonance between how coding is taught and also how poetry is taught, in terms of like how you're mixing it? Have there been any like things that you had to unlearn and kind of like reframe your mind in order to like accept to create your own piece?
Yeah, that's a question I'd like to ask back at you. So for coding, actually, I found college classes absolutely useless. They don't really teach you any practical skills in terms of creation or building anything. So it's really something that you kind of got to do on your own. I didn't take too many literature related classes. The one I did take was actually a fiction writing class. So fiction is very different from poetry. So I imagine the classes are very different. And I found myself extremely frustrated in those classes because my professor would always just be like, this feels a certain way. I'm like, okay, what do you want me to do about that? I was just never getting straight answers, which bothered the engineer in me. So I found that was something I had to navigate outside of school as well. How about you? What was your experience with that?
Yeah, I felt like when going into this, from jump, I had to be like, oh, I don't know anything about language. What is a noun? What is a verb? And kind of like start there. And it's like, and just realizing how complicated just those simple terms are, or just how much lives in that. And so because of that, I think, you know, my initial idea with, you know, writing poetry is kind of like, oh, I'm using language, but I'm using language in order to express myself, pretty basically. But I think what I had to sort of unlearn for myself was that I think I was like sort of taking, you know, when we're influenced by artists that we love and that are teaching us, sometimes we get in the mode of kind of like following even the voice that kind of that we are you know, learning from and following and being absorbed by it. So I think what I had to understand is like, how can I, you know, what you call it, not simply be able to mimic a particular syntactic flow, and how can I be able to truly understand what is different between this line and this line, what is syntactically, what is emotionally, what is grammatically, and even just down to punctually of like how are people utilizing punctuations, which is really wild. People be out here with some amazing poems, right that. So I think they're able to, that the dissonance of like feeling like I had to in chess is almost like, oh, you have a particular opening that you have to memorize certain variations, and like you kind of like moving along those lines and such, but it's almost like you don't understand what that opening is doing. It's almost like you're kind of like following along a trend in order to reach a good position, but not fully understanding it. So I think that's sort of the equal the forms of unlearning that I had to do between chess and poetry is like, all right, I do not know what I'm doing. I'm following certain patterns. Now let me sort of like unlearn that so I can create patterns of my own purposefully, and just keep that going. That's what I had to be like.
Yeah, what was the pattern that you found hardest to unlearn?
Hardest unlearning. Okay, so I think all right, so when I used to write poems, I think something recently that I found kind of bring my mind's going everywhere, like because of this thought, is like the idea of well, sometimes I have certain tendencies in my poems. And I think everyone can sort of like find it where they might use certain words often, or they might even end a poem in a routine way. You might have it where they end it in a very joyous mood all the time in order to like let all the intense elements kind of like settle in a more acceptable like ending. Or you might have some other endings that kind of like really leave it open-ended and like really just leaving you out in the air and kind of things like that. So I feel like with what the square poem allowed me to figure out is like, oh, I'm using either pronouns, like I'm always maybe starting a line with pronouns, or maybe I'm always starting a line with the or a, right? And I feel like because of that, I'm like, now that I see that pattern, I'm not just, I not now that I see what I'm inclined to write, I can't do that with a square poem. I'm forced to kind of like use multiple like different parts of speech as starting points. So I think that's what it kind of like showed me of like, well, you kind of like start sentences in this way and like all the time. Like maybe you should sort of switch it up and like start with a verb or even a preposition, more often, or like in different ways,
Cool. Yeah, it's interesting how technical the patterns actually get and what you're trying to break, because it ultimately comes down to actually some very concrete things that you can act on, which I like.
Yeah. No, for real. Yeah. Did I see something in the? Oh my bad. Sorry, I was looking in the chat.
Yeah, I think we're getting close to the end. I want to have time for some of the Q&A questions that we're getting. But I was just like, I want to let this keep happening. Like this conversation is so good. I love how we talked about patterns and like unlearning some of what we've learned. Which like I'm in an MFA right now, and there's all this learning and unlearning happening at the same time. So like I'm like, oh yes, I feel this. So that's really great to hear in the conversation and everything that's been said. I've taken so many notes. But I want to have some time for Q&A questions. We might have time for just one, but we'll see. We have a question that says, I have some beginning poetry students interested in playing with new/experimental forms. What advice do you have for creating or finding new forms to try that are meaningful?
Yeah, I'd say a lot of that is kind of just looking at the world around you and looking at things that you often use. Like, is it a calendar or is it a chessboard or some kind of game, some scrapbook or something? And then how can you use that to express some kind of art form? That's often what I'm doing. A while ago, I built like a interactive calendar, and then it took you each day you could click it to see the different text over a period of time. So that was an interesting little exercise to do because it really put you in the frame of how time passes and how you can develop a story or a poem through that. But overall, I'd say just look at the world around you, even the very commonplace things, and see what kind of meaning you can find from that, as well as looking at a lot of literary magazines that publish interesting things. And there are quite a few out there.
Yeah, I just have to piggyback on Lucy. Like that was exactly like there was a moment when I was even in a classroom with a child like 7 or so, and like for weeks coming back to the class would not talk, like would kind of like be a little bit isolated and such, but and it was like for weeks of just, like, oh, how you doing? Blah, blah, blah. You're like, you want to have this at prompt and, is this something you're interested? Blah, blah, blah. Let's try this. And nothing would work. But sort of then observing that this kid is always drawing. And it's like, oh, here's some visual poems. Like someone has like some images and they put words around it or inside of it. And then all of a sudden it's like, kid going ham. Just like doing all these like really cool, interesting forms. So I think from Lucy's comment of like observing the world, observing what's around you is just really important, of like not thinking that poetry is supposed to be only on the page or is like supposed to be secluded in a linear format. It's like poetry is literally just playing with words in a sense, in a poetic fashion, of course, and there are other criterias, but it's like, I think that's just welcoming the outside world, back with Lucy's thought.
I love that story. Thank you for sharing that. And like it resonated with me too. Because there was a time I sort of like hit a wall, didn't know where the work was going. And then once I started using more concrete poetry, visual poetry in my work, like something sort of opened, and like the work became fun again. So that sort of really resonates with me. We have more questions. We have a question that says, I'm interested, this one's for Nkosi. I'm interested in what you learn in particular from the failures of trying to write a square poem. Is it joy? Perhaps something about the form? I'm still thinking about the third axis too. Nkosi, you're muted.
Thank you. My bad. With the failures, I think it's pretty much. I would say that how I'm dealing with failure within the grids is, it's like when I think part of me is there's a bit of kind of like stubbornness of being like, if I can say something, I should be able to put it into this, and kind of like seeing what are the limits of my language, of like what I'm able to say, and like how word order, the how we naturally kind of like follow certain words with other words is kind of like important to me to see that like it is possible to do whatever you want within whatever type of multi-directional forms, and that it shouldn't be where you are kind of like where there shouldn't be no limits in a sense. So I think with dealing with the third axis, on dealing with the punctuation is now kind of coming to terms of like figuring out that the way that we write and read poetry is kind of like, just from left to right, and then you have like other languages bi-directional that going also from right to left, and then you have like certain Eastern languages, which are then kind of like actually going from top to bottom, right? And so it's like, how can that then survive in a form of any kind? So it's, I guess I'm not really kind of like talking about, and like when you think about failures, is I think the feeling is really a glee, because I'm like hoping that I can prove myself wrong, that, oh, I see that, oh, this sentence is not working, and then why? And then it's also like, oh, instead of having the verb phrase started, I might have the noun phrase started and then the verb phrase ended, where I can get across the same idea, but just understanding how I'm saying these things, how I'm what you call it, I'm going to just stop there because I'm looking for words, and I think it's just putting me now at a stop. But yeah, prove myself wrong and writing revision. Yes, that's the sort of like the thing. So I'm not with the failure. It's not really a failure. It's just trying to break through to make it possible. But it is sort of observing what those failures are and being like, oh, I see that, this comma is really doing like, it's not allowing me to be smooth in this particular line. How do I say it without the comma? How do I make a line? So this is just a bunch of trial and error.
How wonderful. I feel like I'm in
And I
a
probably would actually ask Lucy almost, but sorry, I feel like Lucy also, I'm like curious about also the trial and error, because when you're talking about, oh, you just like going into a form of coding, like, see what happens, and then it just turns into that, and like things are moving and things are actually like functioning. I'm like, yo, nice response to that.
Yeah, there is a lot of trial and error, and the piece actually in Hayden's Ferry review was especially annoying in some senses because there's so many different tasks to go down, and I have to click through everything. And it's like as a good QA, you got to test everything, you got to click through everything, you got to read through everything, make sure it all works and flows. And I've made like less involved pieces, interactive pieces that are much easier to handle. But for this one, yeah, a lot of it is the revision, and the trial is just about clicking in and experiencing it live and then figuring out what to do from there.
Love that.
wonderful. I would love to keep going, but we have a time limit. It's been so wonderful to have this conversation. I feel like I just experienced like a very generous craft talk, and I'm so thankful for that, and for all the generosity that you brought, and like all this incredible walkthrough that you've done with us of your work and your process. And thank you everyone that submitted questions in the Q&A. Okay, I'm gonna pass it to Christina, who's sort of gonna wrap us up for the night.
I just want to echo Nicole. I feel like I just witnessed a craft talk. This was fascinating, and I'm so thankful we have a recording that's going to be on our website. I'm sure many of us feel like that, so that we can just watch this back. This was awesome. So thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you to Susan Bree, our intern, who helped with the webinar. Obviously, Nicole, Lucy, and Nkosi. And thank you to Arizona Humanities for making this program possible. You will also receive a brief survey to offer feedback on your experience at this event. So we would really appreciate it if you gave us your feedback. You can also stay in touch with HFR by signing up for our newsletter. So hopefully Susan will drop that link in the chat. We also just opened for submissions for our theme remix for the month of November. We'll also drop a link to submit in the chat. We would love for you to submit to that. And just finally, thank you again to everyone for joining the coffee chat. We really appreciate you being here for this hour, and have a great night.